Hi, this is Mike again with Getting Everyone Moving, a podcast sponsored by Palms and Pines Parasports. And today we have Josh Pate, Professor Josh Pate, and episode 9. Hey, Josh, how are you doing?
I'm great, Mike. How are you doing today?
I'm doing all right. Yeah, thanks. So let's get right into this. So Josh, how did you get involved kind of in the adaptive sports field?
Yeah, really, it was as a participant, and it was later in life. I have cerebral palsy, and I walk with forearm crutches, and so I was about 30 years old, and in a job, just sort of doing the same thing every day. But I was freelance writing for Ability magazine, and I worked on a story where they sent me to uh, Aspen to learn how to sit ski, and so I went and did that, and it was incredible. And someone said it would be a life-changing experience, and it certainly was. So I've skied every year since then, and now I purchased a hand cycle and exercise regularly and try to, there are days when I wake up sore because I've been standing too long or doing something too much, but I consider that to be a good thing. That means I'm moving and active and got things going on.
So how has these opportunities impacted your life? I mean, emotionally, physically.
Yeah, both for sure. As far as physically, I would say that it's kept me active. With cerebral palsy, I would not say that I've regressed in my ability to do things, but I've got two kids. I've got a 13-year-old and a 6-year-old, and even now I'm 41, almost 42, and it's allowed me to stay active and keep up with them because they're active. And my wife is very active. She's a runner and she exercises regularly, and so I think it allows us to be almost in a ministry type of role of health, minister health to our kids, or at least show them that by example. I still like to eat my chips and dip and my desserts and all the bad foods, but I think being physically active is something that we preach to them, and we can say it, and because we back it up. And from a mental standpoint, this year, 2020 was certainly a challenge to a lot of folks in that area. And I would say it's sort of made us rethink the way that we do physical activity too, even as a family. We got out and did some hikes, if you will, even if they were not very accessible. I've got a scooter that we would take with us, or we did ones that were accessible and sort of just enjoyed the time outdoors. And so, yeah, there's a variety of things that just allowed us to stay confident and to have a more positive body image, positive image of ourselves overall. That's certainly how it's affected me over the years, for sure.
But I saw some pictures on Facebook recently of your family hiking, which looked like a whole lot of fun. We're actually starting a hiking program this coming Saturday out here. There aren't a lot of accessible trails. I mean, what do you do? What keeps you going? What gets you to get out and hike?
Yeah, I would not say that we do that regularly. I'll be clear about that. But I will say that, during COVID and pandemic and some stay-at-home regulations, we were able to go seek out some accessible trails. And those would be trails that are either identified as paved trails. And they were fun for us as a family to enjoy. I mean, I would even, I've got a mobility scooter that I take usually if we're going into a big city. It helps me navigate long distances, and my family can still walk with us. But this time we were out on a paved trail, and you're sitting there in the middle of the forest or in the middle of some trees. And either way, even if it's just a half a mile, it was really enjoyable, and just a time for us to get out. I would say, there were other trails or other places that we went to where a short distance was fairly accessible for me because I could navigate it with my crutches, and, just took a little extra time or precautions. The one trail you're talking about that you saw on Facebook, earlier in the year in 2020, we were in Colorado, and we went to a pretty steep trail, and it was pretty, well, it was not accessible, but I had a friend that was helping me, and my wife was helping me, and even my kids were looking up ahead. Hey, we're going to have to go this direction. And, you know, it was really, really difficult. And, but man, that ended up being the highlight of my year, of something that I got to accomplish. And certainly it was through the help of having friends and family to help me out. So I'm not afraid or ashamed to ask for help in those situations. And that's actually what helped me create a memorable experience.
Talk more about your support system and how important that's been in your life. You know, I guess to encourage you, to keep you going.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, my parents, even at a young age, they never really sat around and threw pity toward my way. My dad was a pretty large and tough guy, you know, and my mom was a sort of a no nonsense, at least as a parent, she was. And so it was, we didn't really sit around and feel sorry for things. I mean, before I started kindergarten, I used a walker. I learned to use crutches going into kindergarten, and have used those ever since. And so they fought for me to be in a mainstream school classroom. And, you know, despite a little bit of pushback in a rural area of Tennessee. And, you know, finally, once that was cleared, that barrier was cleared, it was really nothing was that big of a barrier moving forward. If I wanted to play kickball in phys ed class, my friends worked with me to figure out how I could do it. I remember being in the church parking lot growing up, and we were playing football, and we adapted. We created a rule that if they threw me a pass and it hit my crutch, then that was a catch. Even though the football would go bouncing away, I still had the ball theoretically. And so that was a way that my friends adapted to allow me to participate. And then that's just kind of continued on. I mean, I'll never forget a time in college when my roommate, who I was close friends with for years, he and a couple of other guys were going to go play tennis. And he was like, come on, let's go play tennis. And I'm like, I've never played tennis and I don't know how that would work. And he looked at me, he was like, I totally forgot. And so for a close friend who, you know, we lived together, to say that he didn't just make that up. He truly did forget, like, I never thought about it, the fact that you'd never played tennis. That to me was a bit of a compliment that maybe I'm doing things that people just don't anticipate. And that's good. I'm cool with
that. I want to shift a little bit to collegiate adaptive sports. There aren't a lot throughout the country.
Yeah.
How do we change that? What do we need to do?
Yeah, I've actually done some, as a faculty member, part of my job is to do some research, and I've done some research on how, for example, wheelchair basketball programs across the country have been started, and a lot of them have started in conjunction with a rehab center or a university that has a tradition of being fairly inclusive. But yeah, they're few and far between. And so when we're talking about incorporating or starting even adaptive sport programs at the college level, I think universities overthink it. I believe, in my opinion, this is from what I've seen from our research, from other research, I believe that there's this attraction to go, you know, to hit the grand slam, to say, I want wheelchair basketball and I want to compete at the highest level and you know, go to the championships and win. And that's a long, long road. And when I think that university settings could just simply make a yoga class inclusive by turning the lights off, or making a low sound or low stimulating environment, or providing a second class that provides those options, or providing detailed information about outdoor adventure activities and what the participant could expect, which may draw somebody like me, or somebody who uses a power wheelchair, or somebody who maybe doesn't use an assistive walking device, but is a little more apprehensive about going down that pathway, literally. So I think there are small baby steps that universities could do at the campus recreation level, particularly, to make their environments more inclusive. Then we can get into purchasing equipment for sitting volleyball, or purchasing equipment for wheelchair basketball, or wheelchair tennis is a good example. most wheelchair tennis players already have their own chair that they compete in. And so therefore the university really doesn't have to purchase anything. They just have to get somebody to coach and attach their name to it. And now all of a sudden you may have a competitive team in your wheelhouse. And so I think that universities, my advice would be for university administrations to go away from this hitting the big grand slam and doing it all at once, and focus a little bit more on the baby steps of what we could already do with no resources required to be more inclusive with our campus recreation and our sport activities.
Let's pick up on that theme of inclusion, which I think is really important. How do you, I mean, personally help to create more societal inclusion, or what do we need to do to, create more inclusion?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, one of the things that I strive to do is have these conversations. So it's easy for me to do that and reach a specific demographic because I'm a college professor. So I have a captive audience, right? So our students, I teach in the sport and recreation management department at James Madison University. And so our students, most of the time they come to my classroom, which is a sport, sociology of sport class. When they come to my classroom, they're typically in their second or third year of college. And a lot of times they've never really been challenged to have a conversation about race in sport, about gender in sport, about religion in sport. And they certainly haven't been challenged to have a conversation about disability and ability in sport. And so we lump all those together into the definition of inclusion through a sport lens. And so, so we have those tough conversations, and I think it's really touching to me when 2 or 3 years later, a student will email me of a current event going on or some situation going on at their hometown or their local school or whatever, and they say, "Hey, this reminded me of class, and I just wanted to share it with you." And it's something that I didn't know about, right? So that tells me that they're paying attention. And I'm not saying that that's the end all be all answer, but I do believe that if we can get a lot more comfortable having conversations about disability, then we're going to stop worrying about, is that offensive? We're going to have parents stop worrying about their kids staring or their kids asking questions. If you have a disability, you've probably experienced being in the mall or being out at Target or Walmart or somewhere like that, and a kid will ask their parent what's wrong with him or her, and the parent, shh, don't say that, don't say that. They'll try to silence the kid, and that's not really the good way either. I think having the conversations is step one, but as I always say to my students, now what's your step two? Okay, we can talk about it, but now what are we going to do about it? And I think that's a much larger and more difficult conversation that really goes back to your other question about, okay, what are we going to do at the college level? What are we going to do at the parks and recreation level? What are we going to do about hiking trails? How are we making those inclusive? I think those are real big challenges that industry professionals need to face and need to tackle right now.
I've found, well, one of the things that we're doing at Palms of Pines now is speaking via Zoom to Rotary clubs. But I've found that there just isn't a lot of awareness, about these opportunities. Well, there aren't a lot of opportunities here in Riverside County, but I mean, how do you create much more awareness? What kinds of things do you want to show people?
Yeah, I think that's a good first step. For example, and I admitted, hey, I've got a captive audience of college students who are, they're at least eager to hear about something new and learn it. But if you're not in that environment, yeah, I think, having these touch points or these contacts where I think too often the disability community wants these other populations or these other walks of life to come to them, right? Whereas let's take disability into their world. And I've always said that as far as my role as a faculty member in sport management. I don't want to be the person where disability is always coming to me. I want to be the person that's taking disability into your setting or into this setting, and to try to make it seamless. A term that a couple of researchers Deborah Shapiro, Mary Hums were on that research team. They have done a few different projects on the term infusion. So we talk about inclusion, and their argument is when this happens in the classroom, infusion means that it's part of the daily life, right? It's part of what we're doing every day. It's part of the fabric of all the work that we do. But too often we get sucked down that pathway of talking about inclusion, where it's just the one time, or it's just the one class, or it's just the one conversation. So I think if we can move to that infusion, I think ways to do it exactly like you're talking about, like having a Zoom meeting with a local club, going to the Parks and Recreation and having a conversation, establishing a contact, when we're allowed to, having coffee with the Parks and Recreation director. Hey, let me talk about what programs you have and how we can put people with disabilities in that. Let's start small, and then we can make bigger steps along the way, maybe.
So is the area around James Madison then, would you say has it been infused then?
Somewhat, a little bit. Yeah. I mean, there's, in terms of youth programming, not so much. Right. And I think that's where a major strides can be taken. But in terms of some other types of programming, we do have a competitive wheelchair basketball team in the Charlottesville area, and they've sort of adopted one of the Harrisonburg teams here locally, which we're about an hour away from Charlottesville. And so that's good news. That's good signs. JMU, we were fortunate to have a gift given to us where we could purchase sport wheelchairs. And so we have used those in our campus recreation programming to have an intramural wheelchair basketball tournament that's really inclusive for all students. So I think there's little nuggets of things going on, and we have some other small programs going on in the kinesiology department at JMU. They have for years have had programming designed for youth with disabilities, and a lot of those participants have intellectual disabilities or non-physical disabilities. So I think there are little pockets of things going on, which I found to be the trend across the country. You got a little thing going on here and a little thing going on here. And the challenge is that not everybody even knows about it. Like, we all are doing things, but we don't all know about it. So we need a common thread. And I think that's a bigger issue right now. But yeah, and I mentioned the youth sport thing. I think that's a big downfall right now. And it's not uncommon. It's just that, I'm hypersensitive to that because I have a 13-year-old and a 6-year-old. And I know if they had physical disabilities, especially, there would be very few opportunities for them to participate in sport. And that would be a problem for me.
Yeah. Speaking about your children, so, they have a dad who, uses crutches as a walker. I mean, what kind of conversations they have with their friends at all? Do their friends ask a lot of questions?
I've asked, actually, it's funny you say that. We were, so actually last night I was having a conversation with our 6-year-old daughter, and she said, I'm glad that I have a parent with a disability. And I was like, why do you say that? And she said, because it's just different and it allows us to be different. And so I'm not, we've said those words before. Hey, it just allows us to be different, and everybody's different. And for our older son, when he was younger in preschool, I went and read a book about being different to his preschool class. I read the same book to my daughter's kindergarten class last year. And it's about being different. And I asked those kids in those classrooms, both years ago and in last year, what's different about me? And their first response was, you don't have any hair. And so that's a success. If that's the first thing they notice, that's a great success. But I think I've asked my son, hey, do people ask questions? And he said, no, not really. He said, people know, they know differences are there, but nobody really talks about it or has any questions. But I also try to be actively engaged with his friends too. If they're coming over, we joke around and we'll play, games, or I give him a hard time. I always tell them that I'm the funniest person that they'll ever meet. And so I think that breaks the ice and goes beyond what the surface level conversation is, which is disability. That's one of the things I kind of go back to is, you know, it's easy to talk about it. The surface level conversation is disability. It takes a much deeper conversation to get to know who people really are. And it's so sometimes it can be difficult for people with disabilities to go past that with others.
I want to ask about, so you and your wife, in terms of, you know, when you were dating and all that. I mean, you know, we all have our abilities and we all have our disabilities, but how did that kind of work out for the two of you?
Yeah, so I joked around with her back in the day. She may not even remember it now, but the best thing that happened, in my opinion, was that we went out on our first date, and then she left for the beach for a week. And that sounds awful, right? But it allowed us to, you know, we talked on the phone every night during that time while she was at the beach. And I think that allowed me to sell her on who I was, right? As opposed to just being surface level. I'm not saying that she would have ever judged anybody on surface level, but that's always the fear, right? For the person with the physical disability, especially, they're only going to see me for what everybody else sees me, or my wheelchair or my crutches or my scooter or my whatever, you know, whatever device, or my prosthetic leg or arm or whatever. So I can imagine that can be a massive barrier and fear for people when it comes to developing friendships and relationships of any type. And because it was true for me. And I was probably too cocky and too confident to let it bother me as a young college student. And now I'm just don't care. Right? But there is that real fear for people. And so I think simple conversations and ability to have those conversations, the ability to understand and what's going on in the world. And I preach this to my 20-year-old college students right now. Do you know what happened in the news yesterday? You should know that. That's going to allow you to have conversations with people. Do you know what's going on in the sports world? Beyond the sports world is what I talk to them. Because in, my sport management students, they live in their sports bubble, and that's the only thing they think everybody in the world cares about, who won their NBA game last night. And so we have conversations about you've got to be at least somewhat well-rounded. And I think that's even more so for someone with a physical disability, particularly because you have to show that, there's more to you than whatever device that you're carrying around for assistance.
So as we near the end of our interview, what would you say to people who, may have just gotten a spinal cord injury, have had to get a prosthetic because of amputation, people who may be somewhat hesitant, right, to get back into life? Sure.
I will say something that I've learned over the years in continuing some writing with Ability Magazine, especially where I've learned this. And even in my own experiences, participating in adaptive sport camps or going to ski clinics and skiing on by myself as well. I've met a lot of people who acquired their disability. I personally have my disability since birth, and I can imagine that it's vastly different experiences, right? For me, I don't know what it's like to play football other than my, adapted version that I talked about. So I'm not missing that, right? I'm not missing something, or I don't have these memories of something that I no longer do. But for someone who's maybe acquired a disability, over the years, I've talked to so many people who have been able to get involved in a sport or in a physical activity, whether it is something as extreme as snow skiing or surfing or water skiing, or maybe it's something as much lower key, like hand cycling for recreational purposes, or maybe it's simply working out or figuring out what opportunities there are to participate in yoga or something to keep you active. In my opinion, those are opportunities for you to develop so many things. Number one, you're going to develop community, because you're going to show up and there are going to be other people there that are either going through a rehab process as well. It may obviously a different experience, but they're going through some sort of process on their own as well. Number two, it may be simply that they are interested in your story, not because of the novelty or this attraction to that, but just because they care. So I think there's that social element involved, but then there's the physical element involved, where if you were active at one point and that's that, you know, something has allowed you to acquire a disability, now all of a sudden that you're being rerouted into a different direction. So perhaps this can allow you to reconnect with that physical activity direction in some way. I just talked to too many people who said that physical activity and sports have saved their life after an acquired disability, and that was profound for me because I didn't experience that. But I'll never forget some of those conversations and how deeply impactful sport participation was for those individuals and continues to be. So my advice would be to try it. And if you look back 20 years from now, are you going to regret trying something new? Are you going to regret trying skiing or water skiing or hand cycling and look back and say, man, that sucked, I didn't want to do it anymore? Or are you going to look back and say, I wish I would have? And if you can say those words, that's dangerous. You don't want to say those words. So that would be my suggestion, is to simply give it a shot.
Yeah, that's good advice for anyone, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, Josh, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks for having me. And I look forward to hearing all these stories of people who are out there trying and doing these new and adaptive things.
Yeah. All right. See you all soon.